Good morning, everyone. This morning I want to begin with a study of the book of Ruth. We've had to suspend our Bible class because of the prevalence of COVID, and I wanted to provide a Bible study, for those that tune in on the YouTube channel. And I don't know how many weeks we'll be doing this, but I wanted to go ahead and go and work through the book of Ruth with you. And as we begin, I want you to understand that this is begins as a story of an Israelite family in the land of Moab. And look with me, if you will, or read with me the first 5 verses of the first chapter. It says, "Now it came to pass in the days of the judges that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Epaphrathites of Bethlehem in Judea. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And Elimelech, I'm trying to pronounce that name somewhat correctly. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband." The opening words date the action of the book, namely in the days of the judges. But when you look into that linguistically a little more closely, it's not a close dating. It's just during that period of time. No attempt is really made to closely date what is here. And in that time, you have this take place. There is a famine in the land. There is distress that takes place. And during the time of these judges, judging in Israel as a complex affair, and it included more than being legal functionaries, even though they did that. But their primary focus was to restore the people and to deliver the people from the distress that they were in and to call them back to God. At this time then, there was a famine in the land, and the land is not further defined, but for a Hebrew, there's one country, and that is the country that God gave to them, Canaan land. Palestine has a rather uncertain rainfall pattern, and it is not unusual from time to time to have droughts that result in famines, and so they're not terribly uncommon there. The Old Testament refers to such famines quite a number of times, but droughts are strange affairs in that sometimes the conditions can vary quite widely in areas that are in close proximity to one another. And so we have an occasion where there's famine in the land of Israel, but not in the land of Moab, though they're not separated by many, many miles. One scholar wrote that he thought that the famine was caused in part by the devastation that was brought on as the people during the chaotic times of the judges fell into a state where every man did what was right in his own eyes. I don't have any way to know that. He perhaps is correct in having made that assumption. But there was evidently no intention on the part of this family of a permanent migration to the land of Moab. They are there because of the distress that the famine is imposing, and they've moved their family to where they can take care of themselves. The use of the word translated to sojourn shows that Elimelech intended to come back. He didn't intend for that to be a long-term or a permanent arrangement. It is the regular word that's used here for a resident alien. In Israel, people that were allowed by the government to stay, the resident aliens, were afforded a certain amount of privilege and rights. Whether that was the case in Moab or not, nobody really knows, but it is entirely possible. There may be, he refers to here the country of Moab as the fields of Moab, uses the plural. And that may just be a way to refer to a predominantly agricultural area, a country. And you see, that's kind of an unusual, they say, linguistically unusual that he would say that in the way that he does, but calling attention to the fact that it's an agricultural area. The significance of why he determined to do that is not really known. It is possible that instead of, as some translations rendered, a certain man of Bethlehem of Judah, we should take the passage to mean a certain man went forth from Bethlehem of Judah. The man's movements would in that case be given here and his place of origin in the next verse. In addition, Judah is to distinguish this Bethlehem of Judah, this Bethlehem, from others in the land of Israel. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at a map of the United States, but if you do, you'll find that town names stay amazingly similar all the way across the country from east to west. There's a Huntsville, Alabama. There's a Huntsville, Texas, and you keep going further west, and you'll find another Huntsville here and there. And it may be that that's happened here. You have, for example, a Bethlehem in the northern territories that were given to Zebulun, and Bethlehem of Judah was by far the most famous, and it's mentioned often. The name Bethlehem probably signifies house of bread or a granary. That might well, of course, be used of various places. And so it's a descriptive term, and it draws attention to the fertility of the region. Earlier, the settlement was called Ephrath, and now come the names of the various members in verse 2, the various members of the family. The head of the household was Elimelech, a name which means God is king, or perhaps my God is king. Names in ancient times often carried profound religious significance and conviction. To name upon a child the name of God was to associate that child in some aspect with God. Elimelech's consort was named Naomi, and it is a name that means pleasant, lovely, delightful, good name for a woman, or good name for a woman that's pleasant, delightful, and lovely. Some have suggested that that this is not a good Hebrew, but it's Aramaic. Well, I don't want to get off in the weeds on that because I lack the competency to compare those two languages, but it seems somewhat unlikely that one member of a family group would have an Aramaic name while everybody else has got a good Hebrew name. And so I just would respectfully disagree with the idea that it's not a Hebrew name. And in second place, the words of Naomi to the women of Bethlehem, who would not have known the Aramaic language more than likely, about the meaning of her name in verse 20, as we'll see, should be understood as Hebrew. And so that's the way we're going to take it. The names of the two sons, Malon, is possibly from a root word that means weak or sickly. Evidently, it was a sickly child. And Chilon is likewise a name with unpleasant ring to it. It means something like failing, pining, or even annihilation. So it's worth noticing that all of these names were found at Ugarit, the ancient city of Ugarit. So these are old Canaanite names that have been in that community for a long, long time. These people are often called Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. Araphath was an earlier name appended to Bethlehem, as we've already noted. And sometimes Araphath is mentioned without Bethlehem, but it's not certain whether the name was Ephrath or Araphath. One is older than the other. The use of the older name in such a connection may point to the fact that this is an old established family that we're talking about, possibly part of the local aristocracy. And they are being forced to move because of these circumstances, but they have the means to be able to do that. At the end of the chapter, when Naomi returns, it will tell us that all of the city was interested, which argues that this is the return of a well-known person. Some of us live with the fact quite happily, but we know that if we were to go and come back, that there probably wouldn't be a big procession or parade or acknowledgement of that. But Naomi generated quite a bit of attention when she came back. This may also be behind the question, is this Naomi? She could say, in verse 21, we'll see, I went out full and I've come back empty. Now, that seems to indicate that they went forth in prosperity and came back lacking that. The term Ephrathite sometimes means Ephraimite, but it is also a reference to inhabitants of Bethlehem, and it's clearly the meaning here. These people went to the fields of Moab, and they remained there during this period of intense famine. We don't know, verse 3, how long they were there. Nothing is recounted of what they were doing until the death of the head of the family. And interestingly, he is called Naomi's husband in the old King James Bible, though it is quite rare for a man to be identified in reference to a woman. But in this story, he doesn't play any part, whereas Naomi is the central figure. And so Naomi was left in life. That is to say, she remained alive. She's widowed. And verse 4, the sons, the text says, contracted marriages. Nothing is said of the activity of their mother in that. She may have been involved, she may not. Perhaps the young men took the initiative, but due to the circumstances, it was probably inevitable that their wives would be chosen from among the Moabites. And so that takes place, and it's a bit unusual among the Hebrew, I would think. And it may be that the writer here does not want the point to be missed, that they've taken foreign wives. He draws attention to the intermingling here with Moab. There was a prohibition against admitting Moabites into the congregation, and the offspring of a marriage with a Moabite was not to be admitted to the congregation. It says to the 10th generation, Deuteronomy 23 at verse 3. But there is no prohibition against a marriage to a Moabite. That was not prohibited. And so those restrictions were limited. There was one scholar that cites a midrash to show that this verse is a silent protest against intermarriage. He says this is the unanimous view of Jewish commentators. Well, for my part, I can go along with that. He apparently doesn't approve of it. But at the same time, he affirms that marriage with a Moabite woman is not forbidden, and that the prohibition is concerned exclusively with the males in Deuteronomy 23. And so for an Israeli man to marry the woman, that was not prohibited. The names of the wives are given, but it's not certain how far we should attach meaning to them, because there's very little knowledge of the Moabite language at that time. But the name Orpha was apparently from the same root as a Hebrew word for neck. The Moabite, if the Moabite was similar, it may signify something like rigidity, stiff-necked, or with ideas of feminine beauty being different from culture to culture, quite different in fact. It may signify something like what was said in the Song of Solomon when he said, "Thy neck is like the Tower of David, builded for an armory, whereupon hang 1,000 bucklers and the shields of mighty men." It may be some description like that. It's also possible that the name is a Hebrew designation given after her return to Moab. Then stiff neck would have a derogatory association, if that's what it means. We just don't know what it means. Ruth is thought possibly to signify friendship, a name, of course, very much apt in view of what's going to take place in this first chapter. It is a name that is much respected through the years. If we can connect it with a root word for a woman and friend, but that's not certain. And so we just have to leave that where it is. After marriage, the young men settle down with their wives, as is typically the case, and the statement is that they dwelled there about 10 years. Probably that covers the whole time that the family was there, and not simply the time of their married life. We don't have any way of knowing how old they were when they were taken to Moab, nor at what time they contracted the marriages. But probably the marriages took place towards the end of their sojourn there. And the reason that seems to fit is that there's not any mention whatsoever of children in either family. But if the marriages were fairly of short duration, near the end, then that point would not arise. In verse 5, at the end of 10 years, both of these men have died, the sons, and it's perhaps unusual that 3 males of one household should perish in this way. In the Jewish reference book, the Talmud, it is regarded by Jewish authorities as a punishment for leaving Judah. No cause of death is given, but for the purposes of the story, that's not important. It's the reactions of the women that matter. Naomi had now been bereaved of her husband and all of her children. What do you do in a circumstance like that? How do you respond to something like that? How do you get up and go on when you've been laid low in that way? And indeed she is at a low state. She's completely alone in the world from her perspective. And the meaning, she was left is, that is, she's separated from her 2 sons and her husband. And in this movement in the chapter, we're going to come to Ruth's dramatic statement of faithfulness and loyalty. Verses 6 through 18. It's a fairly long reading, but it is a thought unit, and we'll read it. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons. Would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone against me. And they lifted up their voices, and they wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. When she saw that this was her determination to go with her, she said no more to her. Ruth's steadfastness is a well-known Bible story. Naomi, in the environment that she was in, verse 6, she has no further stake in the land of Moab. There's nothing to keep her there. And so the news that the famine that had brought her family to Moab in the first place is now over. That was sufficient reason to cause her to decide to return to her home country. And this led to a problem for her daughters-in-law, which they faced in different ways. It brought from Ruth a magnificent declaration of loyalty. In verse 6, Naomi begins to return home, and the word that is translated arose is often used for a little rising up, and also frequently used to indicate the commencement of something, especially a journey. And it's used in such a sense here. Then she started, the Revised Standard says. The part of the daughters-in-law here is not certain, but the verbs are all in the singular. So they describe what Naomi did, that Naomi in the singular, just Naomi arose and began this. And then as it progresses, the tense of the verbs become plural as they were going together. And so she took the initiative about returning home, and at first those young widows associated themselves with her. And the reason assigned for the return is the report that has come to her that the famine is no longer a problem, that God has visited his people. So they're going to give credit to the Lord, which is certainly the case, as it should be, for having restored the people and having provided for them. This verb, visited, is often used in the Old Testament to refer to the activities of God, for the moves of God. And it is used here and, of course, in that way. And it is a warning, among other things, against presuming on the holiness of God, and a reminder that God delights to bless his people. And on this occasion, his visit means the end of a terrible famine. The bread now available, these people regard as a gift from the Lord. They attribute to their good fortune now to his smiling upon them. In verse 7, the initiative is clearly here with Naomi. She went out. And then it is added that her two daughters-in-law were with her. And the next verb, went, is plural, as I've indicated. So the three of them take the road towards Judah. And the impression that one gets is of a very poor household, so that Naomi's preparations for the journey were soon made. There wasn't a whole lot for her to see to in terms of material goods and what have you. The three women could thus walk together along the road that leads to Judah before a final decision was reached as to whether or not they were actually going to go there. And so they're going to begin the journey with her. And we'll see how it transpires as we've just read. In verses 8 and 9, the verses introduce us to the writer's propensity for dialogue. He out of 50 verses or so, over 50 I should say, out of 85 verses are taken up with dialogue. And so it is obvious that what the writer prefers to do is to tell his story through conversations. The mother-in-law, Naomi, invites the younger widows now to leave her and to return to their homes. It is no part of her plan to have them change countries. So she tells them to return each to her mother's home. It is interesting that she refers to the mother rather than the father, but this book is written from a woman's point of view. Ruth at least had a living father, we'll see in chapter 2, verse 11, and possibly Orpah did too. But in a polygamous society, the place for such as Ruth and Orpah would be in the women's quarters, presided over by the mother. Yet the expression remains somewhat curious, all the more so since the father's house is the general Old Testament way to refer to the place of a woman. Even a widow returning is here. Nevertheless, this is it's not done that way. Naomi prays that Yahweh will deal kindly with them as they have dealt kindly with the dead and with Naomi herself. And we should not overlook the fact that she uses the name Yahweh, the personal name of the God of Israel. It might have been expected that in speaking to Moabite women, she would have used the more general term for God, Elohim, or even Shemash, the name of one of the principal gods of the Moabites. But she didn't do that. And it is very revealing that in the circumstances, Naomi uses the name Yahweh. For her, this pagan god Shemash, she doesn't have to give any consideration to him because clearly she has no regard for him. She knew but one God and quite naturally spoke of him. And such a use of the divine name springs from a deep, deep monotheism. There is one God, and Yahweh is his name. Deal kindly with, that phrase deal kindly with represents a Hebrew expression that's difficult to translate into English. The principal word, the key word is hesed, and it's often translated loving kindness. It is a word which on occasion means something very like loyalty, and on occasion something very like love. In the Old Testament, it is often related to the covenant, and it indicates the kind of warm and loyal attitude that the parties ought to have for one another. Naomi recognizes that Yahweh is God, that he is a God who is faithful, and that he is a God who is loving, and that he will deal with his daughter-in-laws accordingly. She sees a fitness in this because the young widows have been loyal and loving to their deceased husbands, and they have been loyal and to their mother-in-law, to herself, and thus her prayer is that their constancy may receive an appropriate reward. Naomi is thinking of their kindness to the dead men themselves, not to their memory, but to the men. And she adds a prayer for the future prosperity of Ruth and Orpah. Again, she uses the personal name Yahweh, and again, she looks for him to be active in the land of Moab. You know, a lot of the pagan people thought that gods were somewhat geographically restricted. You'd have a god over this territory and a god over that territory and a god over yet another territory. But Naomi really recognizes that God is active and can be active anywhere and everywhere, and so she prays specifically for each of them to settle down, to be able to settle down with a new husband. The word in the text is translated sometimes rest with a husband, and of course that implies a home. But it is the former, not the latter, that is meant. The rest is being emphasized. In antiquity, there were, of course, very few jobs for women, especially in rural areas, and so marriage and family were virtually the only career, if you will, option open to them. There weren't women involved in virtually everything like there are today. And it was one thing to have a husband and to have a family and a home. That was the one thing which promised stability in the ancient cultures. Naomi saw no future for the young women in her own country. Being Moabites, they were much less likely to remarry in Israel than they were in Moab. And what else could they do here in Judah? Once they get to Judah, what else could they do besides share her poverty and in a hard life? So she kissed them in farewell, and the trio joined in loud weeping, which was an Eastern expression of grief. It's a Western expression too, for that matter. In verse 10, Orpah and Ruth agree in the rejection of their mother-in-law's suggestion. They assure Naomi that they will certainly go back with her to her people, but Naomi's not going to commit them to the uncertain life that faces her. They are young. They may very well remarry in their own land and thus find security. She is too old for marriage. She has no prospect for providing them a comfortable home. With her, there is likely to be nothing but poverty and uncertainty. She doesn't want that for them, so she addresses them tenderly as my daughters. And they had been called daughters-in-law 3 verses back, but here it's my daughters, and tells them to turn back. And she points to the hopelessness, the seeming hopelessness of their staying with her by reminding them that she won't bear any more sons to be their husbands. And the reference here is, I believe, a reference to the custom of levirate marriage, whereby the brother of a man who dies childless would marry the widow and raise up an heir for the deceased brother. The custom regulated in Deuteronomy chapter 25, beginning at verse 5 and progressing on. Evidently, the first child was accounted as though he were a son of the deceased man. Naomi is saying that there is no prospect for such a marriage in this case. What of Mahlon and Chilion? They died childless, and their widows might normally have looked to levirate marriage to preserve the name of the deceased. But in this verse, Naomi speaks of having no sons in her womb. She's not pregnant. And in the next, she proceeds to the thought that she's too old to remarry. In verses 12 and 13, she draws attention to her age, too old for marriage. Then she embarks on a somewhat different argument, but it's calculated, just like the preceding argument, to show the impossibility of the young women's coming to stay with her. Even should she become a wife again, she says, and bear sons, they couldn't wait for the boys to grow up. The age gap is too great. Now, Naomi is clear that there is no point in their continuing with her. They should seek remarriage elsewhere. And so she tells them to go their way. She rejects with a decision the thought that Orpah and Ruth should continue with her. And her no or her nay, that carries a finality with it. It's not an easy decision because she goes on to express regret. It grieves me. It is, she says, far more bitter for me than for you. They had each lost a husband. But Naomi lost a husband, and then she lost all her children, her 2 sons. Moreover, the young widows could remarry and thus find security and happiness, but this is not an option for Naomi. There's no prospect other than a lonely old age, embittered by the thought in her mind that the hand of the Lord had gone out against me. That's what she said in the King James Bible, and that's her conviction. And I don't know whether he had or hadn't, but she felt that way. She felt abandoned, and she's in great distress. And these concluding words arise from a conviction that God is sovereign, and he brings about these things that come to pass. So Naomi can ascribe ultimate responsibility to no one but him in her mind. The hand of the Lord, of course, is an anthropomorphism used to describe the capacities of God, to express how God moves and functions. God's hand is a way then of speaking of his activity. And the verb gone out is sometimes used as of an army going out with hostile intent. Naomi cannot encourage the girls to go with her because she does not feel that God is pleased with her. In verse 14, her words provoke more tears. And again, the women raised their voices in lamentation, but this time there was also action. The meaning of Naomi's words sank in to each of the two younger widows, and they react. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law. In verse 9, Naomi initiated the show of affection and kissed Orpah. But on this occasion, Orpah has recognized what's taking place. That this is final. And she understands that now. She didn't initially. So she takes the initiative and kisses her mother-in-law. This is farewell. And they both know it. Now, when we look at Orpah going back to her people, we need to recognize there's no good reason to disparage her, because she did what her mother-in-law told her to do. So obedience is not a virtue either to be overlooked or censured. We may well feel that Ruth showed more imagination and a deeper love, but let's don't be too quick to blame Orpah. At the same time, we've got to notice that Ruth was not so easily persuaded. She had given her loyalty to Naomi, and she would not lightly withdraw that. So when Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye, Ruth clung to her. The same cause induced Orpah to go and Ruth to remain, and that is that Naomi had no longer a son or a husband. The one wished to become a wife again. The other determined that if she had to, she would remain a daughter. In verse 15, the subject of said, the word said is not expressed, but it is Naomi. The context shows that. She uses the example of Orpah as a lever here to induce Ruth to follow her sister-in-law's example. She doesn't speak of Orpah as having returned home, or to her own country, but she speaks to her of her as having returned to her own people, to her gods. Her people means her nation, not her family, as the English expression might express or indicate. The reference to the gods is sometimes held to point to a belief that a god and a certain piece of territory are closely connected. I indicated that earlier. The classic example of that is said to be Naaman, who, having become a worshiper of Yahweh, took back to Syria with him 2 mules of burden with earth from his homeland so he could worship God on home soil. But the idea is far from being universally held. That's some that feel that way, many do not. Ruth's answer is the classic expression in verse 16 of faithfulness. She declares in very clear and eloquent terms her undying devotion to Naomi, and she refuses to leave her now or any time in the future. She first tells Naomi to cease entreating her to leave her, and then she affirms her determination to go where Naomi goes and to stay where Naomi stays. She realizes what this means, as her following expressions indicate. She will be cut off from her own people, but she will make Naomi's people her own people. And her decision has religious implications of which she's not unaware. Naomi's God will become her God. This does not mean that she has no religious principles or that she rates friendship above faith. In the very next verse, she invokes Yahweh, which indicates that she already has come to trust in him. Her trust may not have been well informed, but it is real nevertheless. In verse 17, Ruth's determination to be with Naomi is not meant to be short-lived. She will stay with Naomi until death and die where Naomi dies. And as Ruth was much younger than Naomi and would presumably live longer, this implies that she will so identify herself with Naomi's community that she will stay on there after Naomi has passed. And the reference to burial seems scarcely to be needed, but we must bear in mind that for the ancient world, proper burial is of great significance and importance. And even after death, Ruth plans to be with Naomi. She concludes by calling down divine punishment upon herself should she fail to keep her word. The addition, and more also, to the undefined, do so to me, indicates the direst possible consequences. There can be no doubt that this young woman, Ruth, is in earnest, and we should not overlook her use of the divine name of Yahweh. She does not invoke Shamash or the gods generally. She has taken Yahweh to be her God, and it is upon him that she accordingly calls. Ruth is determined that nothing, not even death, shall separate them. This little speech greatly impressed her mother-in-law. And she saw that Ruth was determined, and it is an unshakable firmness. So Naomi accepts the situation and ceases her argument. Indeed, after Ruth had concluded with a solemn oath, there would have been something impious or very close to it in seeking to dissuade her. They arrive in Bethlehem in verses 19 through 22. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem, and when they had come, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. My name is Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has witnessed against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So the journey back to Jerusalem is not described, but the reception of the two widows by the women of Bethlehem is. They received a welcome. But Naomi could not but contrast her present state with the condition that she had when she left the village. The pair had journeyed on to Bethlehem in verse 19. And as they approach the city, there's a buzz of excitement, and the whole place is involved. And this is almost, it's the women, and that's almost inevitably the case because the men were at work in the harvest at this point. And the women of Bethlehem saw the pair approaching. Some of them greeted her, it seems, with excitement. And they said, "Is this Naomi?" Years had passed since she lived there. And no doubt she'd been through some very difficult times. It had treated her harshly, those years had. And it would not be surprising, accordingly, that if she was sufficiently altered in appearance to make that question appropriate. Naomi put stress on the meaning of her name. Her experiences have been anything but pleasant. And so she disclaims the name pleasant. She suggests that the women should call her Mara, a word which means bitter. Her reason is, in her mind, that God had dealt bitterly with her. She's blaming God, apparently, for the loss of her husband and her 2 sons. Naomi doesn't think of chance or of the work of the gods of the heathen. She is sure that her God is over all, and so with that explanation in mind, she attributes bitter things that she's experienced with him. The name she uses for God here is Sareh, not the commonest name, and one that appears to mean Almighty. Sometimes you'll find El Shaddai, God Almighty. Naomi thinks of the irresistible power of God. And when he determined that bitterness should enter her life, in her mind, there is no other possibility. And it is worth noticing that this name, Shaddai, sometimes is used, or Shaddai rather, is sometimes used in context of blessing. And it's also found wherein the severity as well as the power of the Lord is in mind. In verse 21, Naomi contrasts her departure from Bethlehem with her return. Left full, returns empty. Emphatic. And she uses the personal pronoun in the first clause, though it is not strictly necessary linguistically. She, for her part, went out prosperous, but he brought her back indigent. She uses the covenant name Yahweh. Yet again, there is the thought that this God is supreme in Moab as elsewhere. Naomi uses the name Shaddai or Shaddai once more. She is helpless in the face of God's almighty power. This verse 22, simply rounds off the narrative of the return. It locates it at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's to be towards the end of our April. But otherwise, simply says it took place. As Ruth had not, as far as we know, ever been to Judah, the verb return seems a curious one to use regarding her. It is perhaps worth noting that returned occurs about 12 times in the chapter. And this is a word which for Hebrew was full of associations. It meant a return to the land of God's people, used thus of Ruth at the end of the chapter. It may be meant to signify something of this. The expression barley harvest is found in some ancient documents, a calendar that speaks of the month of pulling flax, the month of barley harvest, the month when everything else is harvested, so we have a good idea of when this occurred. If God be willing, we'll continue there next week. I want to thank you for taking the time to study with me this day.